Hey, yo, what's up, fellas? I'm here with two representatives from Maoism for the Masses, Full Metal Maoist and Comrade Paul. If you guys want to introduce yourselves shortly.
Yeah, if I go first, my name is FullMetalMaoist on Discord. I am a Black Maoist, and yeah, it's very much basic intro.
Comrade Paul?
Yeah, hi. I'm Paul. I'm an Indian immigrant to America, and I've been a mouse for about like 4 years now, and I've been writing on those sites since it started in 2022.
What's the story behind the site? If you guys could just give a sort of quick description of it for anybody who's not familiar.
Oh, you're well, like OG than I am, so yeah, you can go ahead.
All right, well, basically the site's founder, we call him Robbie. He figured out how to set up a WordPress site with someone from Quora because we all used to be on, I think, well, at least he and I used to be on Quora. That's where we started our online work and writing and stuff. And then we moved to WordPress to like make the site because we figured it'd be a little more professional and like it like look better and be easier to send to people. And I found it to be really convenient in that I could write debunking anti-communist propaganda articles and just send them to people to educate them. So we're using it as like an educational platform primarily.
Yeah, and it's absolutely filled with great articles about theory, about history, about just anti-communist nonsense in general. I highly recommend anybody who hasn't gone on to Maoism for the Masses to go into the website. Jumping into our questions, because I know we're a little bit tight on time. What is Marxist-Leninism, Maoism, first of all? What are its core beliefs, and like how do you distinguish it from Marxist-Leninism?
I guess I'll go a little bit first on this one. So, Maoism, which we like to call the short A or Marxism, basically sets itself apart from kind of Orthodox Marxism in that it has, we have more advanced like tactics and theories that we believe are essential to revolution in the modern era, as defined from outside of the Cold War era. Because beforehand we had Marxism, and then around the turn of the 20th century into the 30s we had Marxism. And then ever since pretty much the 80s and onward, we pretty much had Maoism. And Maoism has kind of become more relevant as the decades come on, especially, like I said, since the 1980s, after, the Soviet Union basically really started to fall away to the wayside. And China, as we kind of will talk about a little later here, we feel has kind of gone the path of revisionism. So in the wake of all of that, and in the wake of multiple contemporary movements, Maoism emerged kind of as a separate stage from Marxism-Leninism. Some specific points that we kind of believe in, more or less. Let me go a second here. Is definitely the first one we want to kind of talk over is our, I'm sorry, 1 second. Gotta get my little notes here together.
Okay.
The first
thing around.
Yeah, I'm a bit of a nerd here, but the first kind of like big principle, I guess you could say, that we believe in is the mass line. So essentially, the mass line is kind of a process by which we filter out and sort ideas that are given to us from the masses, and we give it back to them in ways that they feel, are the way that they feel speak to them. So, but these ideas can either be revolutionary or reactionary depending on their quality. So, certain ideas, if we feel that they are, helpful to the revolution and overall helpful for the masses, we will talk about them, reformulate them, and give it back to the masses. And if the masses accept them, the way that we present them, then we will gladly implement them into our overall strategy. In the case of more reactionary ideas that don't help us, let's say, for example, me and Paul both live in America, for example. So if you have some guy coming up to you and saying like, oh, well, I think my main concern is that all the Mexicans are coming from the job and stuff like that. Like, how should we approach that? Obviously, that type of idea is coming from a reactionary background, and it really doesn't overall help anybody because it's more or less built off our lie that have been built. So what would we do in that case is we would isolate this individual and we would repudiate that idea and, keep going to the masses and sifting through them basically to find some ideas that we feel are going to be overall advantageous, you could say.
Okay.
So that's just kind of one tool we have. Another one that we believe in is what's it's called free match weapons, which is kind of a silly phrase, but it is what it is. Essentially, these three tools are the United Front, the party, and the People's Army. So the United Front basically is a slew of organizations that are all, they can either be like above ground or underground. It just kind of depends on what their kind of like setup is. But they all are focusing on one thing, which obviously is civilization revolution. So, like I said, if you look towards the Philippines, for example, they have multiple different organizations, some of which are above ground and legal, quote unquote, and some of which, what I guess you could consider illegal, quote unquote. And these organizations all, of course, work together underneath the guidance of the Filipino Communist Party to advance the revolution, but they have different methods in which they go about it. So it's kind of like that, at least affirms the United Front. And then we also have the People's Army, which, as the name implies, is just the armed forces, kind of like the military-ish power behind the, revolution. And then we have the party, which is, the central body of the entire kind of communist movement, you could say, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've been dipping my toe to Maoist theory and Maoist history. That's how I found your guys' site, actually. And it really seems like Mao learned a lot from the failures of the Soviet Union and the successes, obviously. Reminds me of that one quote, 70-30, wrong and right for Stalin, if you could correct me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Comrade Paul, do you have anything to add?
I guess I'll just briefly mention the question of People's War, and I low-key didn't really want to talk about it just because it's kind of controversial even among us Maoists. For like the Communist Party of the Philippines, for instance, they're one of the parties waging People's War. We'll talk about them later. They assert that People's War is only applicable to semi-feudal, semi-colonial countries, whereas other Maoists believe it's universally applicable. But basically what People's War is like, it's a strategy of revolution that relies on like, protracted warfare, as it's called in the name, protracted People's War, involves like guerrilla tactics and mobile units like attacking the enemy. And while in the third world countries, it can often involve like the countryside surrounding the city, where the countryside is the base of the revolution. Other Maoist theorists have suggested that urban guerrilla warfare could be like the basis of PPW. But basically the theory is just we utilize irregular tactics of warfare to go against the imperialist enemy. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because according to like bourgeois analysts, like the US imperialists, like generals and stuff, they recognize that Mao is to irregular warfare as Napoleon is to regular warfare. I think that's a quote in some like CIA document. So like Mao's military theory is absolutely essential to understand any sort of guerrilla anti-imperialist movement. Like, I know we don't like the Taliban, they're a reactionary Islamist group, but they used basically Mao's military strategy, like of like surrounding the city from the countryside and using guerrilla tactics, and they used it successfully.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Yes, and it should also be made. Sorry, let me cut you off.
No. I was just gonna say you can sort of see how universal Maoist theories are. Like you can see it sort of happening in Palestine almost right now with Hamas against Israel, the Al-Qassam brigades, and you know, even if they haven't directly read Mao, his analysis was so scientific, people discover it without even recognizing it. Go ahead, FullMetalMaoist.
Yes, I would also like to make a point of attention that I do believe that the U.S. military actually does study Mao's on guerrilla warfare book, if I'm not mistaken. So yes, they definitely seem to recognize the power by which, I guess you could say power, by which Mao's idea has. So, yeah, they definitely do take this stuff kind of seriously. And I think that fact that they even do so should be maybe, you know, like a bit of a hit to us that maybe these ideas do have some, indeed have some, you know, applicability here.
Absolutely.
Now, the exact way we go about it is going to be, you know, obviously a discussion more so for when that formation comes about. But the general idea that can happen here is definitely something that we feel could, you know, should be talked about.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So moving on, what is the Shining Path and what are its theoretical contributions to Maoism?
So the Shining Path was formed around the 1980s. I guess a point of clarification is they didn't call themselves the Shining Path. The name was actually given to them by more of the reactionary forces because they primarily identified as the PCP, so Peruvian Communist Party. But more or less from that, they essentially were, I guess, kind of, you could say, the OGs of Maoism as we kind of understand it, because they were the ones who, Gonzalo himself, if I believe, if I'm not mistaken, did venture to China. I don't know if he directly met with Mao, but he did kind of study Mao's theories and stuff like that. And when he came back to Peru, him as well as his organization more or less began to implement these ideas around the time of the 1980s. So this would have been after Mao's death, of course, and this would have been during the era which we call, the post, kind of when the Soviet Union was falling apart, and kind of when, the reactionaries, globally speaking, were kind of getting their feet back from under them, like I'm saying. So in this time period, they came up with a couple of new contributions to Maoism in the fact of mainly concentric construction. So essentially, what concentric construction is taking the three magic weapons I talked about earlier and kind of formulating them into a kind of, how you would say, like a bubble, or a theoretical bubble.
Mhm.
So if you imagine a bubble here, you have three layers of it. You have the United Front out of the outside. In the middle of the bubble, you would have the like one layer above it, you would have the People's Army, and then in the very center of the bubble, you would have the Communist Party. So the party would be, of course, be the main organ of the communist movement, and then outside of that, would be the People's Army, and then at the very edge of that, like I said, would be the United Front. So it's kind of level. They're kind of like basically levels, each kind of layer you could say is done just so, because this also is a security measure, because whenever we do form parties, there's always, especially in America, there's always a chance of infiltration by reactionary forces. So this kind of layering is done as a sort of security measure to prevent, what otherwise would be critical or sensitive information from not getting out to everybody. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So that's kind of...
It really seems to it's almost like a three-front battle, you could say, and it's more. Would you say it's more horizontal than like traditional vanguard parties?
I'm trying to think of that. I'm trying to think. That terminology could definitely... you could say there could be some elements of horizontal construction, but like I said, it's mainly, from what I said, it's mainly a security measure. But
Okay.
there is, of course, freedom within it, of course. So you're not gonna be a United Front that just be completely left out of the loop, for example. But there are certain things that obviously, as you get higher up, you more know, or you know more.
Okay.
But obviously, there are certain ideas like on the outside that you don't want to know, because not every person who comes up to us, unfortunately, is going to be a revolutionary. Some of them are going to be a little reactionary. Some of them are going to be feds. Some of them are going to be enemy forces in general. So these, construction is meant as, like I said, a security measures, basically.
Okay.
And then outside of that, there are other things, Paul, if you would like to kind of give what you believe also should be taken from the PCP and kind of,
Oh, sure, yeah.
Oh, he's back. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, basically, like, just as a thing about concentric construction, it's basically just applying like Lenin's theory of democratic centralism to the organization of like the movement as a whole. If you think about it, because like the party has to listen to the army and like the masses, but at the same time, they're all centralized around like the revolutionary movement, which is led by the party.
Mm-hmm.
So just like put simply, concentric construction is just applying the democratic centralism to the entire movement. But as for other contributions from like the PCP, one thing I'd like to bring up is the idea of guiding thought, which is basically that the particular application of revolutionary theory to a given country. And like Mao Zedong thought is the first example that comes to mind, where it was the application of Marxism-Leninism to Chinese conditions. And that like application is what resolves the contradiction between universal theory and particular conditions. Because we don't want to be like dogmatic applicants of ML or MLM. We need to like take into account the conditions at hand and how exactly we're going to wage revolution, given the relations of production in a country, the economic base of a country, the superstructure, all that. So that's what guiding thought is for. And the PCP theorized that idea, and like said that every single revolutionary movement needs to define its guiding thought in a like general political line. And for Peru, that was Gonzalo thought, and like they said that all revolutionary movements have that. And I guess one more theory I'd say is like the PCP thought of something called the jefatura, or the great leadership. And that's basically another thing from democratic centralism, where the party structure inevitably leads to upholding leaders of the like revolutionary class, the proletariat, and like this group is generally a small group just because of how democratic centralism works. But these become sort of like a vanguard of a vanguard. And yeah, that's another thing that the PCP thought of.
And also, I guess we should add a point of contention that this is not like, say, great man thinking, as a lot of people would ascribe to it. This is something that this is a process that inevitably happens just as the revolution kind of continues on. There are going to be people who the masses generally believe should be upheld and, are, I guess you could say, thankful for, otherwise give praise for, because, they feel that they stand out above the rest in terms of whether it be their bravery or their intelligence attributions or what have you. So this is not something that is artificially created. This is something that naturally comes about as a result of practice.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's sort of like a core of leaders that are like very highly disciplined, vanguard revolutionaries. Just like Lenin theorized that, like very experienced revolutionary. That would be that great leader you called it.
Yeah, great leadership.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. So how would you say Mao is like commonly understood in like liberal histories? I know often he's like made out to be like worse than Hitler, or the twin evil of Hitler, or the man who's killed the most. And why would you say these like sort of depictions of Mao are wrong?
I think I'd like to talk about this first. So briefly put, just as a funny story, I dressed up as a Red Guard for Halloween. And at school, like, people generally didn't understand like what I was. Some people actually thought I was like Hitler and stuff. It's because like it just goes to show the lack of education among the masses. Like, imperialism lies to the masses, and as he said, it makes Mao equal to Hitler or worse than Hitler. But these ideas are just like wrong. They like the death toll described to him are exaggerated. For instance, the famine that happened in the 1960s, which I'll talk about later in a different question. But basically, that famine's death toll often includes people who weren't born. Like, they count like fertility rate, and they see that it fell during the leap forward, and they say like, oh, these people who weren't born, we'll call them dead. And that's how you get like absurd tolls, like 50 million or some crap. It's nonsensical.
I believe the number was 67 million. I've heard that number, and it should be said. It should be said that this number, obviously, it comes from the Black Book, and the Black Book itself is obviously not a very historically accurate or even an intellectually accurate book. So any sort of figures or something like that are taken from this book, whether they quote it directly or not, should definitely be met with scrutiny and criticism, because this book definitely is not a honest piece.
Yeah. So what would you say? People often describe China under Mao like as authoritarian, and everybody was like horribly oppressed, and it was like one big sort of like prison. How would you say combat that idea?
You can go first.
I'm sorry. I was just going to say, like, one interesting thing about China's approach in socialism in the mountain is like very much it differs in certain ways from like the Soviet approach, and we'll talk about that later as well. But one interesting feature about China is that like it was the masses themselves, like the people organized into like mass organizations, and they're the ones who conducted class warfare directly. It wasn't like a state-directed approach. Like, the state was involved, of course. It was a worker state. It had to be. But like when you think about land reform, for instance, that was conducted by the peasants themselves, and a lot of landlords were executed by the peasants themselves. They weren't like state executed. They were like the people took matters into their own hands. So if anything, you might want to, if people do want to attack Mao's China or whatever, they might say it was too democratic, or it gave too much power to the masses, or didn't regulate the masses or whatever. That's what anti-communists should be saying, but they don't want to reveal that, because if they reveal that to the masses in America or in any other capitalist state, the masses will see like, oh, Mao's trying to actually empower the people. We should do that too. And that's why anti-communists make it a big deal to like demonize Mao's China, along with all socialist states, really.
And I guess also another point of contention would be, of course, that Mao himself is very much revered in China, even though, as we were talking about earlier, China's kind of false revisionism. Even before that point, even during this point, there are some people who lived around the time when Mao was empowered who definitely will attest to the fact that Mao was a great leader, and that he brought China kind of to an era of prosperity that it probably wouldn't have had otherwise. Because, like, keep it a buck here, like China before the World War II, for example, was completely dominated by the Japanese, and well, it's like a third world country essentially. Whereas now, during the rise of kind of like during the 60s and 70s when Mao was in charge, China was definitely on the up and up, as you could say, and it got to a point now where it's considered a superpower. And even though, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of revisionism, China couldn't get to the point where it's now, to where it's actively, up there with not 100% with the U.S., but kind of getting up there with the U.S. alongside of Russia as like one of the three biggest countries in the world. And it definitely would have gotten to that point, heading up, and from Mao and his rising of China in general to be the kind of status it is right now.
Yeah, I think very often liberal economists want to give China's rise to that Deng Xiaoping era reform liberalization. But I mean, if you compare like China to India, which is right next door, similar population, similar history, colonized, it's night and day. That foundation that Mao laid for China is just amazing. It's absolutely, it absolutely gave them a head start compared to every other country. And then, of course, there's things like communist China having one of the greatest recorded boosts in life expectancies in history. I mean, it's the accomplishments of the Mao era are crazy in a positive way. So I think liberal historians are liars, or at the very least, very biased. Just to be fair and impartial. So, Full Metal Maoist. What would you say were the major similarities and differences in how China implemented socialism compared to the USSR? Obviously, the USSR was the first state to ever implement in socialism, so China was able to learn a lot from their mistakes and their successes. What did they improve from the USSR's implementation of socialism?
So obviously, a big focus on agricultural development was one. We'll talk about the Great Leap Forward as well as the GCPR, which especially was very important for China and how they kind of implemented socialism. But just in a general broad stroke, a great extension of proletarian democracy was definitely a big focus in China. Like, if you compare the Soviet Union to China, you'll see that there is a bit more parity between the party and the people, you could say. If, like, there isn't, not necessarily the Soviet Union was like, I guess, the quote-unquote authoritarian, even though I hate that word because it's meaningless. But there was a bit more of like leeway between the masses and the party here in China than it was in the Soviet Union. There were like some elements of like the decentralization, you could say, and there also was a much bigger emphasis on the masses being able to have their own kind of direct action. And rather than like the parties kind of stepping in and kind of doing class struggle for them, it was mainly the masses who were kind of guiding the class struggle. You know what I'm saying?
Comrade Paul?
Yeah, I basically agree with all that Metal just said. Like the Chinese socialism involved, like it was focused on like masses development. That's why Mao said the masses make history. And part of Mao's like critique of Stalin is that like Stalin put like not enough like emphasis on the masses. He didn't really like trust the masses per se. He kind of had a paternalist approach. Not to say like he didn't empower the masses, he did. So the Soviet Union was a genuine democracy, but like China under Mao had like greater democratization to the point that like People's Communes, for instance, didn't have a police force. They didn't have a military. Their only armed force was the militia, and that was because the masses were trusted with power. Whereas in the Soviet Union, the only way the masses could exercise power was through state bodies, which isn't bad per se, but it does mean that like if, as it happened in the Soviet Union, those bodies fall under like bad actors' hands, the masses are cooked. Like during the Great Purge, the Yezhovshchina, it's called, Nikolai Yezhov had control of the secret police in the Soviet Union, and as a result, plenty of good communists died. China didn't really have that much of that problem. They more so had a problem with the masses through their organizations like being like excessively violent. But you could say that like China overall had like that sort of balance between the masses and the state.
Mm-hmm. Could you describe a little bit more how the masses were sort of able to interact democratically than the Soviet Union? Elaborate a little bit if you could.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. One example is during the Cultural Revolution, this government body called the Revolutionary Committee was introduced, where it was formed of representatives of the party, the army, and the masses organizations such as Red Guards. And since all three had like that's like say that voice in the local government, the masses could directly voice criticisms without necessarily using without the indirect nature of like reporting their issues to the party. They could directly voice their matters to the government as a whole. Whereas in the Soviet Union, like anytime you wanted to report a corrupt manager or a corrupt official, you had to go to a party militant in the workplaces. And so while the parties still overall had leadership in China and that it provide ideological guidance and like it controlled the overall government. That direct like mass like voice, the people's voice, was like a way that the Chinese government used the mass line, where the Soviet Union kind of was like lacking.
Okay. Okay. So very often, China's like described as very top down, but in reality, it was way more. It was a communication between both top down, but also bottom up. You would say. Am I describing it perfectly?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And so, moving on, how did Maoist China engage in the international class struggle, and how did that differentiate itself from the USSR? Maybe we could talk about Stalin and the post-Stalin Khrushchevite revisionist era.
Yeah, so we could definitely talk about that. So, obviously, China, for example, we know supported Vietnam during the Vietnam War. Now, the Soviet Union also did, but this is one point. But also, during the beginning of the Filipino revolutionaries kind of revolution, they supported them during the 1960s, if I'm not mistaken. And I have a couple other. I'm gonna pull up this list here. I know I got a bunch of notes and stuff like that. But yeah, they supported Korea, as well as the Malay and Filipinos, obviously, I said, but also the Burmese and the Thais. So, and they even supported the PLP and the PLO during the beginning. So they definitely have like a bit of a, I guess you could say, a laundry list of different communist and national liberation struggles they supported during Mao's time, especially. Obviously, now there was some contention with some, like, I guess you could say, because during, for example, the Cuban Revolution, obviously, I believe it was, I don't know, but I think it was Castro who, didn't really, I don't want to say support Mao, but I don't think he took more of Khrushchev's side during that kind of era that he did with Mao, if I'm not mistaken. But there was an era, obviously, and we also can talk about the Sino-Soviet split, but basically, China during the 60s especially supported a lot of different movements, to the point where China was kind of like I guess you could say, the backbone of these movements. And once China kind of changed around, we'll talk about that more during the later questions about how they kind of changed their kind of stance on the Filipinos in the second year. So there was definitely a lot of different organizations that they supported during that time. So they definitely fully wanted to rep, I guess, opposed to internationalism the best way they could.
And then how did that differ from the Khrushchevite revisionist USSR? Certainly, they did support some liberation struggles, but not nearly as much as Mao's China did, and definitely in different ways. So could you elaborate on that?
I think I'll briefly talk about that. Where one thing that you notice about the Soviets, like always, is that like whenever they support a movement, they'd always be like, yes, we support the movement, but ideally we want a peaceful resolution. That was Khrushchev's whole thing, peaceful coexistence. And while peaceful coexistence isn't always wrong, it's specifically for like relations between countries of equal footing but different systems. So like an independent capitalist country and an independent socialist country, you can have peaceful coexistence. But Khrushchev was trying to universalize that idea to the point where he was telling oppressed nations and oppressed oppressed people's armed groups to like put down their arms and negotiate with the imperialists. Whereas like Mao understood that that's idealist nonsense, where the contradictions between the oppressor and the oppressed are intense enough where armed struggle is the only way out of it. And that's why the Soviets were often less principled in supporting, say, the Vietnamese. They often encouraged like negotiation, like they excessively so encouraged negotiating with the U.S. imperialists, whereas the Chinese encouraged armed struggle and sought victory for Vietnam. And if you look in like anti-imperialist movements in the West, you see that the pro-Soviet groups would often say peace for Vietnam, whereas the pro-Chinese groups would correctly say victory for Vietnam. So like that applies for Palestine as well, where the Soviets supported peaceful groups more than armed ones. And I mean, they did support the armed ones, yes, but China was more so in favor of like the expulsion of Zionists and the victory of the indigenous Palestinians. So,
I guess you also could say that Vietnam in particular, I think as right now, in terms of the military, and I still have some of this stuff as well, they use a lot of Chinese copies of Soviet weaponry, because, obviously during the time when Stalin was in power, the Chinese did copy a lot of Soviet weapons and certain equipment. But obviously, once the Khrushchev came along, then that's relationship kind of strained. But a lot of Vietnam's stock you could see is a lot of the Chinese copies of certain Soviet weapons. For example, the Type 56 SKS, as well as the Type 56, which is based on the AKM, I believe. They still use those weapons to this very much day. And I actually have one of the a Vietnamese version of the Chinese Type 6 chest rig, the 10 slot version. So they definitely still use that equipment to this day. So even if you want to, so even though like I said, we could talk about Vietnam later in terms of if you want to about how we feel about it later. Even during that period of time, at least they definitely had a big big helping hand, I guess you could say, in the war of Vietnam.
Right. And you can also see that internationalism, for example, the Korean War, where China actually sent troops, whereas the Soviets sent like some military support, mild, but not actual troops on the ground. And Mao even sacrificed his own son, sent him on the front lines to battle for the freedom of Korean people, which doesn't relate to Chinese people at all. It really seems like Mao's that Maoist line, I don't want to great man of history, but was really more about that full liberation, while the Soviet line was more about an easy peace, even if that meant that like Comrade Paul said, that continuation of that oppression. If you guys agree with that at all, I'm kind of speaking out of my ass.
Yeah, you're right. No, you're good. He's correct.
Okay.
But I just briefly just want to say about Korean War. I don't like at the time it was still like under the Soviet Union was still like a worker state. It was under like proletarian elitist power. So I don't blame the Soviets for not sending troops at the time. Like they had just come out of World War II. I don't like low key like what they did was plenty at the time. But later on, as the Soviet Union recovered from the war and its economy got better, their like contributions to people's movements around the world got less, and they were actually arming oppressive states. Like my home country, India, when the Naxalite rebellion began, where peasants, in response to the old Communist Party's failure to lead the masses, these peasants, they led the organization of a new communist movement, a revolutionary one. And you can criticize that movement all you want, but they've actually empowered the masses in ways that the religious parties and the Indian state have not done at all. And in response to that, the Soviets armed the basically fascistic Indian state and supported the oppression of the Indian peasantry, the Indian proletariat, the oppressed nations of India, which there's plenty of those. So whereas China was like firmly supporting the revolutionaries in India.
Okay. Yes. Could you talk a little bit about how the USSR, while it was still a worker state under Stalin, engaged in internationalism? I know it was more focused on industrializing itself, so it was a little bit more insular, you could sort of say. But was there any mass like international support that's like sort of undercut by, let's say, Trotskyist propaganda?
Oh yeah. For example, the Spanish Civil War, the Soviet Union was the only major power to support the Republican forces in Spain. The American imperialists, they gave the excuse, like FDR gave the excuse that if I support the Republic of Spain, Catholics would never vote for me. And as a Catholic myself, I'd say that's not true. I'd vote for him because I love the Republic. But basically, the Soviets actually gave the Spanish Republic and the communist forces and the progressives weaponry and training and basically what they needed to try to defeat the fascists. But because the Soviet Union themselves had to like secure their own ground, like they had to be careful, as you say, like they tried to build socialism first. They were in a tough position, so they couldn't really support the movement in Spain. And the movement in Spain made a bunch of errors that led to its downfall in the face of fascist aggression. So like that's like one key example of the Soviet Union's internationalism.
Okay. Let's move on. What was the Great Leap Forward? And what are some like misconceptions about it? I know you do like a quick YouTube Google search. It's like 40 million dead, million starved under, authoritarian Mao. So what are some misconceptions about it? What were its failures?
So I guess I can kind of talk about this. So with the GLF, regardless of how you feel about it, was more of a net neutral, net positive kind of for China. Obviously, like I said, there were some errors that it had, but it was nowhere near the big, like I said, 40, 50, 67, 70 million number that we have something here, because like I said, this number, and like Paul also said, this number included things such as people who weren't even born. So it's pretty much, I don't think to this day we'll ever even have a, what you could say, a totally accurate number of potential, I guess you could say, deaths from the GLF. But even despite the setbacks, the GLF still ended up having some net positive results for China. And like shortly after the GLF ended, they met their industrial goals. Of course, the GLF, they never had a famine ever like that ever again. Like, and that kind of also contributes to the way modern China is now, to where it's more, I guess you could say, food secure, as opposed to before that point in time, especially around, like I said, during the 50s and early World War II, stuff like that, so where it had, those type of routine famines that we kind of see. And of course, the life expectancy after this point in time, still, despite the errors, like I said, had exploded past like what it was previously. So there were definitely, like I said, you could say increases in living standards for China, even with the setbacks of the potential setbacks of the GLF in mind. So to say that it was like a failure or that it was like a complete disaster, it's definitely, an outright lie, I guess you could say. And a lot of bourgeois historians, of course, will say this, but like I said, their recollection of history, as they want to say it, is definitely lacking, because, as I've said a couple of times here, the GLF, regardless of its setbacks, still improved China and it got on its path to where it is today. China would not be where it's at right now if it had gotten the food security, the industrial, you could say, production, and the other attributes that the GLF provided for it, had that not happened. So that's one thing you guys could say about the GLF.
Okay. Comrade Paul?
Yeah. As for what actually caused the famine, yes, the government's it had like very big goals to the point where like the people could barely achieve them. Like they achieved them after the GLF ended, but it was very hard to achieve it. They had a lot of sacrifice, and that was only compounded with a bunch of like internal and external like contradictions, where in terms of like within China, leaders such as Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi were actually responsible for encouraging local leaders to exaggerate like their statistics of harvests, and that made the state take like a pretty high taxes of food, to the point where like they were taking more than the people's communes could actually give. And that was like a big problem that the rightist leaders in China actually caused. And even though these rightist leaders later on like blamed the Great Leap Forward itself for those problems, it was really their fault for sabotaging the Leap Forward's like progress. And in terms of external factors, the Soviet Union at this time, under Khrushchev leadership, had demanded that China repay its debt, because in the early 50s, under Stalin, the Soviet Union gave a bunch of assistance to China to start up its development. And like Khrushchev basically demanded that China repay that back fast. And so China had to export some of its best agricultural products, to the point where even leaders like Mao himself had to forego meat, and like they had to deal with rationing themselves. And that, for one, that shows that like the Chinese leadership were like a very proletarian leadership. They were working class leaders, like the working people's leaders. And they stuck with the masses. They fought through with the masses. But it also shows that like the Soviets had betrayed the revolution. They betrayed the cause of the working people around the world by hampering socialist China's development. So that's like those two factors, plus the insane weather events that happened in China. Like I think half of the agricultural land was destroyed or like weakened due to the weather events, like drought or flooding. And so with all that compounding, it led to a famine in China, inevitably so. But the Chinese people fought through, and now they've not experienced famine again.
Okay. And Full Metal Maoist, I know you mentioned it, but what were the major goals of the GLF, and what did they achieve? Did they get close to those major goals? If you could go into specifics, if possible.
Honestly, yeah, so here, give me 1 second here. I gotta pull up this, I guess you could say, notes here, but give me 1 second. I know what kind of traveling time here, but I'm trying to have all this stuff.
It's okay. I appreciate you having notes. Oh yeah, and then Comrade Paul, if you could just briefly, for like anybody who doesn't know, like what even was the GLF? Just like very, very briefly, while Full Metal Maoist.
It was basically like a mass movement that like sought to move China's relations to production and its productive forces forward, where it collectivized agriculture, because before then, like land was privatized, like land reform took place, but that meant private peasants had their own land, and so there was like contradictions between rich peasants and poor peasants that were rapidly developing. And so to move on from that, they decided to collectivize land and got into what are now people's communes. These are like really large agricultural cooperatives that collectivize like probably 10,000s of people's like land and a lot of their means of production. So like the expansion of collectivization was a big part of the leap forward. And along with that, thanks to this collectivization, they pushed forth an industrialization path where they sought to improve their steel production and other industrial products like output. And like that way, they thought China could get like an industrial foundation to continue developing. And the one big problem, as I said, was like the attempt to get really high goals really rapidly. And that led to like the sacrifice of certain materials to produce like mediocre products. Like people like anti-communists exaggerate how bad it was. Like they say like, oh, the pig iron was useless. Like no, pig iron is like a necessary product in eventually making steel and other things, but it wasn't very good. And so like the leap forward tried to make the industrial products and didn't completely do that. Like it didn't do it as well as it could have, but at the same time, it still overall achieved its goal of, I think Mao said, surpassing Britain's steel production. Like China was able to do that by 1964 or so.
That is pretty amazing, and it seems like it was a very horizontal. I hate using that word, but like from the masses, bottom up industrialization compared to the Soviet Union, which of course is the first socialist experiment. It mired in its own contradictions. They tried a very top down sort of. They did have feedback loops between bottom and up, but Mao's was much more focused on the bottom. Could you describe FullMetalMaoist? Have you found your notes?
I'm still looking for them.
Okay. Could you describe the people's communes? Like, how did they operate? Were they similar to the kolkhozy, the collective farms that the Soviet Union had, or were they a little bit different?
I could get is that they were similar to the kolkhozes in that they were cooperatives essentially, but the members of the communes were like they owned shares of the cooperative, so to speak. But the difference is like communes were also like they weren't just agricultural. They also had like the part of the point of the leap forward was to introduce industrialization to the countryside. And so the communes had control over like their own industrial centers, like factories and like steel production and mining and whatnot. And the communes were also like units of government power within the countryside. They were like the worker state. Its basic unit in the countryside was the commune. The commune representatives formed like the government within the countryside. So they were similar to the kolkhozes in being cooperatives, but they were different in that they were also political and they moved on beyond agriculture.
Okay.
And I guess one thing to say is that like in the Soviet Union, under-style kolkhozes did not own big means of production, but in China, the communes did own big means of production. And you could see that as like a kind of a drawback of Chinese socialism, where even though overall we Maoists would say Chinese socialism was more advanced, it got closer to communism than the Soviet Union. One drawback China still had was that the communes owned means of production, whereas in the Soviet Union, the communes simply paid for repairs for the means of production. They didn't actually own the means of production. The means of production belonged to the state in the Soviet Union, and that's more socialist, so to speak, than what China had.
Okay.
But overall, like, yeah, the communes are like, they had both industry, agriculture, and government power.
Okay. And I've read John Gurley's book about Maoist China's economy, and he talked about how Mao would not try to have like specifically, he would try to have like well-rounded intellectuals, like people would work at the tractor factory and then also work on the farms. So he wouldn't have exactly experts, but he'd have well-rounded people that were integrated into all aspects of the economy. Could you talk about that? Would you say that John Gurley's assessment is accurate? Like having a person work at a tractor factory and then also be a farmer so they can repair their tractor easily? Was his assessment, he's a very famous communist economist. Is his assessment good?
Yeah, I'd say like that's basically correct. Like that's one thing Mao wanted to do in getting close to communism, the division of labor. And so like one thing he saw was like working people gained intellectual knowledge and like actual like expertise, while the educated professionals were put to manual work. And so that narrowed the division of labor between the mental and manual labor. And like it also reduced the contradiction between industry and agriculture, which if you read Stalin's work, Economic Problems of Socialism in the USSR, he talked about how the Soviet Union also made progress in that, but they still had work towards that. And China also didn't fully resolve that contradiction. Of course, it's hard to do so, but they made substantial progress thanks to the communes and thanks to their mass-based approach and all that.
Right. It really got close to that. What Marx and what we today describes as full communism, where they aren't these like hyper intellectual, how do I describe it? A pseudo hierarchy within working itself, where some people are just these experts in field and intelligentsia. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
So it was a really good roundabout way of getting over that. FullMetalMaoist, have you found your notes?
Yes, sir. I found a couple of sources here. So I'm reading this directly from China.org.cn, and I can also link this to you as well if you would like to get a read of it, because it seems pretty helpful in terms of kind of getting a better grasp of what the goals of GLA were, or GLP, I'm sorry. But the gross value at China had actually doubled between this point in time. So the amount of grain production in 1962, which was the last year of the Great Leap Forward, had reached about 750 billion with the B kilograms. 150 grams of cotton or cotton dans. So 1 dan is equal to 50 kilograms. Steel had gone up to 80 million tons. Coal had reached up to 900 million tons, and cotton yarn had increased to 16 million pieces. And capital investment had gone all the way up to about 385 billion yuan, and major constructions were, kind of going up, up to past 1,000. So the GLP, like I said, basically this all kind of goes to the narrative that the GLP, regardless of its setbacks and stuff like that, you can clearly tell, based off the evidence that we read here, as well as a couple other articles we have as well, that China's economy, despite the failures, had grown in this period of time. So, like I said, I guess let's go back to the whole narrative to say that the saying that GOP was a failure is definitely further from the truth than it could be. Well, just like I said, it had errors, stuff like that. It was nowhere near the nightmare scenario that bourgeois economists and bourgeois propagandists like to tell you, because the way they like to describe it to you is like everybody was dying, basically. Everything had somehow fallen apart. But yet, somehow China decided the GOP's supposed catastrophic failures have made it to the status where it is right now, to where it's contending with the U.S. If, China was supposed to, and this is also, that goes to, I guess, the narrative, if China really was, this country that was absolutely just languishing at this point in time, then how could it have possibly got to the point where it is right now?
Absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
So even
comparing China and India, it's night and day. From that base that Mao gave them. And John Gurley also, that economist I was talking about, he's a Stanford communist economist. He's obviously biased, but he calculated that China during the GLF was one of the fastest growing economies on earth. So it truly was an amazing achievement. Moving on, what was the great proletarian cultural revolution, and what are some misconceptions of it? I know often it's described as sort of Mao's personal purges of people he didn't like within society. And what were his successes and failures? Could you start out with a beginner explanation for anybody who's a complete outsider?
I guess I can. So the Green Proletarian Cultural Revolution essentially was an attempt to get rid of the lasting remnants of reactionary thought within China. That's very much the biggest. Essentially, if you could phrase it up, I would definitely use Mao's phrase, "It is right to rebel." That is basically if you had to dumb it down as like one word, or one term, I would say that's definitely what I feel like would be the best to fit it. Because during this period of time, it was not Mao who personally did this thing. In fact, he actually encouraged the masses of all people to be the ones who would critique and purge the party. If they felt like a party's representative, I guess you could say, was not, representing their interests the way they should be, that person would be critiqued and would potentially be exposed depending on the severity of their issues. So, and definitely without, Mao personally looking at people who he didn't like, I don't like this guy, let's get rid of him. It was the masses who were looking at this guy saying, this person has done this, that, and the other thing. We feel that these person's actions have done against our interests of the masses. This person should be expelled, or depending on the severity of, if crimes, other punishment could potentially happen. But that's essentially what it was at the end of the day. It was an attempt to remove the last bourgeois and other reactionary elements of society from modern China.
Mm-hmm.
If you could, as a brief summation, as you could say, one of the biggest things that came from it definitely was the focus on women's rights as well. Mao famously said, "Women uphold half the sky." This is especially interesting in China, coming from a background of reactionary practices against women, such as foot binding. So this like I said, there was a lot of changes in the GCPR that definitely kind of set Mao apart, definitely from say other, I guess we say, implementations of socialism, because here Mao was expressly wanting to have the masses be the ones who would push the country forward to from socialism to communism, and the best way to do so it was to focus on the class struggle, because I feel like that's actually going back to Maoism as well. One of the things that Maoism kind of I feel understands better than Marxism, not to dismiss Marxism, but it's just that from what I can observe, there is a big emphasis among Maoists and people who follow Mao among how class struggle continues under socialism as compared to, I wouldn't say like socialism doesn't continue under like Marxism, but there isn't as much of an emphasis, I feel, as there should be. And I feel like that's the reason why a lot of figures like Khrushchev and other individuals were able to rise to power the way they did, because of the lack of, that's the full lack, but a general, like, I would say, lack of ability to critique the party, as well as, critique the party from without, because the masses in China were encouraged, like I said, to critique the party and to hold the party accountable to what they wanted, versus, and they had, I believe, gun ownership as well. So sometimes they would need to use arms if necessary in order to kind of do the critiquing, because sometimes there might be bourgeois elements deeply entrenched in the party that might not be immediately relevant, but those elements need to be purged as soon as possible. Else we get to the modern situation where we are now, where the Soviet Union is gone, but even during this waiting days, it was a revision entity, and to where modern China, which we'll talk about a little later, is kind of the way it is right now.
Comrade Paul?
Yeah, as Metal said, like, it was about empowering the masses to keep the party proletarian and get rid of bourgeois elements within the party. And a common objection, I'll briefly bring this up to the Cultural Revolution, that it destroyed a bunch of historical artifacts. And while that's true, and that's just a fact that did happen. Number one, a lot of artifacts were actually discovered, because like the whole point of the Cultural Revolution was to make people improve people's education, and part of improving people's education is improving their historical knowledge. So like when Mao theorized of the Cultural Revolution, he didn't want those artifacts to be destroyed. He didn't want like his slogan, destroy the old world, to be taken too literally. It was more so like destroy the old world's ideas, and that was achieved fairly successfully in China. And as for the excesses of the Cultural Revolution, Mao was able to like curb that with the People's Liberation Army. And while violence did occur in the Cultural Revolution, overall it was like the violence has been overstated and the destruction has been overstated. The truth is that it was like a democratic movement of the Chinese people, and it was progressive and revolutionary overall.
Right. I know it's still somewhat controversial within China today. Many former Red Guards, don't want to talk about their involvement in it, or shy to. Could you talk about specifically the Red Guards themselves and what they did? Were they agents of the Maoist state, or were they democratic from the bottom, or was it a mix?
Yeah, so Red Guards were like these paramilitary groups made often by students or workers or peasants that on paper they all claimed allegiance to Mao and to the Communist Party and to the working class. But in reality, like, they each represented different, like, you could say, sects or factions within the party. And while some of them were like a lot of them were genuinely like left-line proletarian groups, a good number of them, such as those in Beijing at the beginning of the movement, were bourgeois Red Guards that like they waved the red flag to take down the red flag, as I think Mao said. Where and these bourgeois Red Guards were actually the source of most violence within China. Like, since they came from like privileged backgrounds, they fetishized violence, and as a result, they overused it to the point where they gave the Cultural Revolution the bad name that the modern Chinese state puts on it. But like at the same time, like violence is like kind of a part of class struggle, and as long as it's not too excessively applied, it's overall like that's what it does. It empowers the class that's like rising up. In China's case, it empowered the working class and allowed it to secure its control of the state, its democratic control of the state, for another 10 years. And so while yes, excessive violence did happen and we should be critical of that, like overall people need to remember that revolution is not a dinner party. It is like dirty work.
FullMetalMaoist?
I don't know. It kind of reiterated what Power said. So yeah, sometimes revolutionary violence is a bit, I guess you could say, necessary in order to achieve the goals of what's happening. I don't want to say like this. I guess you could say, how to nobody phrase this, like the ends justify the means, but unfortunately, it is just often the reality of revolution that often violence is definitely an implement that must happen. And I think this is also kind of going against the common liberal notion of, especially when it comes to oppressed people, about how, like, for example, I'm black, for example. So the civil rights movement, for example, during the 1960s and 50s, it wasn't just, people marching, protesting, peacefully. There was often a lot of violence associated with it that often gets covered up. Or if it isn't covered up, it's treated as a negative. Like, people often like to say this big dichotomy between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, when oftentimes such economies only in the mind of liberals. Like both approaches are both equally valid approaches that can be applied when the time needs. So sometimes there are more peaceful methods that can be applied, but sometimes there are more violent methods that need to be applied. And it kind of goes the same for the what's it called, the GPCR. Like, sometimes violence might be used if it is in the service of expelling the reactionary forces. And I don't think any communist or modern communist should hold the deficiency that everything can be done in the modern U.S. peacefully, because that's just not a reality of things. Pretending that there is some sort of peaceful means by which we could somehow, I'd say, empower the masses is essentially fantasy.
Yeah, and it's such a rare event that a successful revolution will have a second revolution within it. You can go back to all the way from, say, liberal revolutionaries like Thomas Jefferson, who recognized that the success of the American Revolution will eventually become complacent and we need multiple revolutions. He said a revolution once in a while is a good thing, but that never really happened. But Maoist China attempted to do a second revolution within its revolution, which I think really does show its connection to the masses. And just like Comrade Paul said, you can criticize it, of course, but the criticism would be that it was too democratic and not centralized as it's often portrayed, as a lot of the intricacies and violence was from too many people from the bottom up fighting each other, and especially the bourgeois infiltrators. So it's less so as it's advertised as a bottom-up authoritarian sort of thing, and more of a democratic from the masses, almost alluding to that a scary notion of that when democracy used to be a scary word, that rule of the mob. But of course, we as Marxists love proletarian democracy. I know we're short on time for Comrade Paul. He has to go to work, but so I'll have you go first really briefly. We've had guests on before that have been pro-Deng China, specifically Vijay Prashad, and who have defended Deng's reforms. What are Maoist understandings of the modern-day CPC?
Well, we see that the modern party has turned revisionist, and the leaders of the party are representatives of the bourgeoisie. This goes back to after Mao's death, proletarian leaders in the party were arrested, the quote-unquote Gang of Four. The reason Mao called them Gang of Four is a side note, simply he was jokingly warning them not to be a gang and to stay with the masses. And for the most part, they did. You can criticize them for being too ultra-left at times, but on the whole, they were proletarian leaders connected to the masses. And for that quote-unquote crime, the rightist leaders within the party, led by Huang Guofeng, had arrested them and ascribed crimes to them that either they didn't do or that they were just doing what the masses wanted. And so they and thousands of other proletarian cadres of the party and proletarian leaders within the Cultural Revolution, they were arrested by the Chinese revisionists. And since then, the party has maintained a revisionist line. It has basically kept proletarian lines down within the party, not allowing much line struggle in favor of proletarian thought. And today we see that spontaneous Marxist study groups pop up, and they often promote an anti-revisionist line in China, and they get suppressed by the state. Mm-hmm. And so while we do not oppose China in the way that U.S. imperialists oppose it, we see that U.S. imperialism is our main enemy. We see that China is a capitalist, and as I think Metal will elaborate on, an imperialist state, and we do not support it. Modern-day China does not support revolution. It supports reactionary states, just like the revisionist Soviet Union once did. Mm-hmm. And does not empower workers like it used to. Nowadays, it oppresses the working class and empowers the bourgeoisie, simply put.
And could you...
Thank you for having me.
Oh, okay. Yes, thank you so much, Comrade Paul, for being on. I know you have to go.
Sorry for the
Yep.
Yeah, sorry about that. But thank you for having us. Thank you for inviting us. And to all the listeners, check out our website if you want like more details on what we're saying. We're trying to be brief, but our site's articles have plenty of details on these matters that you can read into if you're interested.
Absolutely, absolutely. Go to Maoism for the masses. I'll include a link in the description, and I'll have Full Metal Maoist give the full URL at the end. So thank you so much, Comrade Paul. You have a good day at work.
All right. Thank you. You too.
So Full Metal Maoist, could you super quickly just explain for anybody who's sort of a new communist, like what even is revisionism, and then your answer.
So revisionism basically is the revising of Marxist principles. Usually this is done. The first big revisionist was Errol Browder, not Browder. I believe it was Edward Bernstein, if I'm not mistaken.
Bernstein,
Bernstein. I'm sorry for my pronunciations, but it essentially is, like I said, the revising of Marxist principles, just so it's the best. So, in modern China, for example, the stated desire for them to kind of go back to capitalism, in terms of them, like, because they were already on a socialist road, as you could say, even during Mao's time. And even though Mao made mistakes, closest to his death, they still were more or less on the socialist road. But then after Mao's death, and of course the appointment of Deng Xiaoping, that's when China really started to deviate into rightism. And Mao, of course, implicitly said that Deng does not understand the kind of like, he talks of his black cat and white cat, because he doesn't understand, or he seemingly didn't understand, the difference between revisionism and socialism. And because of that, Deng's policies have kind of gotten us to where we are right now, to where China is now a capitalist imperialist power, was referred to as Lenin by a social imperialist power. And social imperialist basically means it's just socialism words, imperialism in deeds. It's very much a basic definition. A lot of people mistakenly believe that Mao somehow coined this phrase, but it actually was in Lenin's imperialism, Diet capitalism. And he basically described it literally the exact same way I described it, which is socialism in words, imperialism in deeds. So in that case, he mainly was using it for, people during, I believe it was Second International, who would support their own home countries during World War I, for example. But now, what we use it for is essentially what China's doing now, which is they are actually, I guess you could say, not assisting with the U.S., but they are doing their own form of anti-communism within the Filipino revolutionaries. Because a couple years ago, I believe a year ago, actually, I saw an article. I was stating how China had sent some copies of the M4 platform rifle to the AFP, which are the Filipino State Forces. And of course, the Filipino State Forces are in combat with the MPA, the New People's Army, who are the main armed wing of the CPP Philippines. So China right now is seemingly supporting the Filipino state against the Filipino revolutionaries, and they are also engaging in imperialism in Africa, specifically in Zimbabwe. I believe there was a story a couple of days ago, not too long ago, and let me see if I can try to look this up, but there was a African worker who was shot by a Chinese, I guess we'd say, official. So let me go ahead and pull this up here real quick. But essentially, yeah, there is a lot of there's a website actually I can also link to. It's called banthought.net. I'm going to put it here, but it's called banthought.net. And if you go to their section on China, there is a laundry list of contemporary imperialist China's actions that basically should prove, to be honest, out of a doubt, that China right now is not the same socialist entity we believe it is under Mao, which is unfortunate, but the reality of the situation is that China had definitely set a turn for the worse. And like I said, this entire article here, this entire section of the website, however, is very, very detailed, and it's very basic in terms of its implementation. So even comrades who don't have the best internet can still be able to pull it up and should be able to read the various articles and stuff like that, because it's very in depth in terms of its sources. So that's kind of like I know it's a lot of words, but basically that's kind of the situation with China as it is so far right now. So let me go ahead and pull the story back up for you.
Yeah, and while you're doing that, could you explain what specifically exactly why is China specifically capitalist? Why has it specifically had capitalist restoration within modern day economy compared to the Maoist economy, and why it's specifically socialist imperialist compared to the Maoist line generally in sort of like how its systems operate, you could sort of say.
That's definitely one of the things that did. That was a review of what I believe is called the Iron Rice Bowl, which essentially was a group of policies. I believe I'm trying to remember exactly what it was because I'm trying to refresh myself. But these were a group of policies that mainly had protections for workers during Maoist era, and unfortunately, these policies were eventually revealed by Dong underneath his what you could say. I'm trying to remember what the exact policy was, but he essentially repealed this as well as after his time, there is the talk of loans. I know some people who support Mao China have talked about the loans for how they aren't as bad as the IMF, which Jose Maria Sison, who you might remember is the I don't know if you guys know this, but he's the was the leader of the CPV Philippines before he passed away. But he did an article as well, and I can also link that here. I'm going to bring it up for you real quick about essentially how the loans they're trying to give, while they aren't as harsh as, say, the IMF, like I said, they definitely are not like these just free candy, as you can say, for these countries. The countries still owe China these debts, and if they're not repaid, the penalties still do occur. So it's definitely not like China giving out free candy or anything like that. Just being, I guess you could say, how do I want to phrase this? Just hunky dory with these countries just borrowing infinite amount of money from them and not giving any payments. Like they do have loan interest and stuff like that. But the purpose of these loans are also doing bargaining for all the copper doors within the countries, and that's also a big thing with Maoism. That's actually different from Marxism as well. I forgot we got to talk about this, but essentially there is a thing called copper door bourgeois. I'm trying to remember the term is, but copper door capitalists essentially. So those capitalists within the various countries that China, for example, would supplement, that essentially they sell their country to China and kind of allow her to invest and give them, of course, finance capital, which is what Lenin called bank plus industrial capital in imperialism, the high stage capitalism. But they essentially allow finance capital to fully flow into their country. And of course, the comprador gets paid for these services, and as well as China, of course, benefits from this by exporting this finance capital because they would get best returns on investment. And one of the countries, like I said, that is happening most in is Zimbabwe. And there is the Belt and Road Initiative. There's also BRICS, which is another economic formalization that's happening with China, Russia, Brazil, India, and I believe I'm trying to remember what the S was. I believe it was South Africa.
South Africa, yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, the formation of the organization like BRICS is essentially forming its own kind of counterpower to American imperialism, not for proletariat internationalism as we would think, but instead it's just for its own brand of imperialism. So that's essentially to say that modern China, like I said, is not the, I guess you could say, socialist entity that it once was. It is doing all this economic investment and finance capital and imperialism solely to bring itself up to compete with the U.S. It's not doing this for the benefit of us, the masses, whether it be the masses in China or the masses internationally. And I think the idea that China is doing this for positive motives is something that needs to be critiqued, especially within the Marxism-Leninism movement. I see it because it definitely is not the case. And I do see a lot of, I guess you could say, nuggets who will kind of justify or make different reasons as to why this is happening. But for my analysis, and as well as our analysis on Maoism for the masses via our different articles, as well as Bad Thought, which also has a wide variety of articles, like I said, that kind of explain the situation, China definitely is not the site here.
Okay. What is the Maoist solution for modern day China? Do Maoists believe that there's still enough elements of democratic centralism left that perhaps it could be reformed, or would it be a new revolution to overthrow the current CPC? What would you see moving forward to get rid of this sort of, as you say, like this revisionist capitalist restoration?
So definitely what would need to happen would be a sort of, I guess you could say, revolution. I believe that as modern China exists right now, reforms essentially are not all that viable. Modern China has both built itself up militarily as well as internally up to a point where essentially it is freely inviting, and kind of cooperating with, not cooperating, but I guess you could say, exchanging with Western imperialist powers. And in terms of the internal structure, the Chinese masses are unfortunately exposed to a lot of, even though they have the great firewall or whatever, they still have are very heavily elemented with the elements of capitalism. So much so to a point where, like the U.S., for example, it's not as bad as the U.S., at least as far as I can tell, but the elements are enough to where the only way reasonably that China can ever correct itself back to the socialist path is through revolution. And whether that be through now, the exact way they can go about that is, of course, up to them because they probably know more about China than we do. But if it's anything like the U.S., I would say it's going to have to be through a revitalization of Mao's policies because China does give lip service to Mao right now, but in order for it to actually be, the way it needs to be, this needs to go beyond just basic lip service. It needs to be full, embracing of what the teachings of Mao as they describe them. So potentially another cultural revolution is more likely going to be a big viable strategy for them. If you look on the internet, you can look at different places. There are still people who, like I said, lived during Mao's time who can ascribe to how Mao was. And I think hopefully the younger Chinese masses can maybe learn from these individuals, maybe, get to a bit more of their own history and maybe see the path forward. And, ideally they would begin to think for themselves and believe that, well, our country as it is right now has strayed from the path of socialism as Mao laid out. Individuals like Xi Jinping, past individuals like Deng Xiaoping, the individuals that are wrong, and we need to, I guess you could say, rebel. I guess you could say against them.
Okay. Oh, so what you're describing is sort of like another great proletarian cultural revolution?
Yes.
Okay.
Something like that. I believe, and it's kind of I guess a bit of irony that the PLA, which is, of course, the People Liberation Army, as it stands right now, is not for the liberation of the people. So I think definitely in America, for example, I believe that part of the strategy is going to be recruiting from these people. And I think that in modern China, I think recruitment among the PLA and stuff like that would definitely assist with the overall GC PR, or this is the second version of it. So there's going to be a lot of different strategies I believe they need to implement in order for them to kind of overcome the modern revisionist government. But it's going to be a long process for them, obviously. So.
Okay. What would you say to people who say China, even if it is revisionist, offers a very important alternative to, let's say, American hegemony or unipolarism of American capital or Western capital?
Yeah, this idea is frankly ridiculous.
Okay.
I want to be very blunt here. I know this is mainly coming from a background of having to engage with individuals who are among the, I guess, Caleb Hoffman / First Red. I don't know if you've heard of these individuals, but these individuals tend to also kind of believe in this multipolar idea. This is definitely not going to work out the way that people want it to. Like I said, China right now is not doing this. What it's doing right now is not doing this for socialist ends or anything like that. It's doing that for imperialist ends. And we as communists cannot support one imperialist over another. This is the exact same issue that Lenin ran into during the Second International. Like, we can't support the Germans over the Americans, for example. And in a similar vein, we cannot uphold modern China over say America when we can, like I said, there's plenty of evidence to sort that China today is not the ally that we believe it is. So to have the desire to say that, well, one is I guess you could say the lesser evil of the other, so therefore we should support them. No. This is not how communists operate. We say that China full stop needs to have its own internal revolution to actually guide it back to the Marxist principles that it was built upon. And only at that point in time, when China actually has gone the correct way, then we could say, okay, well, now that China is actually a proper socialist country, now we can support it and throw our weight behind it, you could say. But as it stands right now, with China being a capitalist entity, no.
Okay. What are some major Maoist struggles occurring in the world today? I know you mentioned the Philippines, and Comrade Paul mentioned the Naxals. And what have been their major accomplishments?
So far, the very fact that they still exist, like I said, especially the Filipinos with the double hammer of U.S. imperialism and Chinese kind of support for the Filipino state going against them, the fact that they still been able to survive at all, as well as the death of Jumba, it's very much commendable. Same with the Naxalites. They've been having their kind of ebbs and flows, their movement for the past couple of years, but they still have been going strong and still are surviving and fighting to this very day. I believe there's also other movements that are working now in Brazil. The PCP, from what I can tell, is still technically active, but they are more underground. I know there is a MPCP, but that is different from the actual PCP. Because the actual PCP, like I said, they're still underground and they're still kind of reforming the movement despite the setbacks they had, after these islands capture and eventually death not too long ago. But these movements are still going on. Like I said, there's movements in Turkey and Malaysia and other countries. So there definitely are a good current of Maoist movements that are still active. Some of them are more active than others. Like I said, the Naxalites and the Filipinos are in a stage of actually waging armed struggle. But the other movements in the different countries are still kind of getting to that point where they can wage armed struggle. They're still kind of building their numbers up, so to speak. And, those movements are still in existence. So they're not God. They're not like, the situation isn't as hopeless as you think it would be.
Right.
I think that's also another net positive about Maoism, that there actually is a lot of movements that are still gaining steam and stuff like that. So it's not completely all doom and gloom, as you could say, especially considering what we came from during the 80s and 90s, when it seemed that international socialism had basically been completely eradicated to the point where even the bourgeois, especially the U.S., for example, after the fall of the Soviet Union, basically stood, proudly on its heels. You got people like Francis Fukuyama saying that we're in the end of history era. That is further from the truth.
Right. Why is Maoism so important in the 21st century? Somebody playing devil's advocate here, let's say like I'm a bourgeois or, somebody like that, an academic, and I say, Maoism is dead, China is reformist, and the Soviet Union is gone. Why even be a Maoist?
Like I said, the very existence of these different movements around the globe, as well as movements that are forming in the U.S. and other Western countries, regardless of whether you believe these movements are going to be successful or not, these movements are still, forming. And like I said, we have two movements that are still engaging, still going strong in the 21st century. So those very things should be commendable and should serve as a kind of lesson to communists internationally. Like, it's not over. While yes, the Soviet Union has failed, while China right now is on the wayside, it's nowhere near over. Like I said, not to the very last of us are dead, basically. So as long as there's one communist in the world, there is always a chance. And the urgency of the situation with the likes of climate change and other situations that are going on, to where the world economy as it is right now is still going steadily in decline. Like, there is no reason to have doom and gloom. I know a lot of us want to kind of throw our hands up and sit on our laurels and believe that everything is kind of going. Yes, we're kind of like in the end times, I guess you could say, but that's further from the truth. Like I said, there's always hope to be found online. Of course, if you're not, a communist, for example, you might think that, there's no hope or anything like that. But if you take a look around and you kind of look around, you will see that there is hope to be had. Like, when I first was starting, when I was just working on this, I had no idea that the Philippines and the Naxalites were happening. I thought there was zero communist movements in the world. But now that I know that those movements exist and they're still going strong despite all the setbacks that they had, that gives me hope personally.
Right. And, I want to ask you two more questions, if that's okay. I don't know if you have any more time.
Oh, sure. We got a bit left.
Okay. So why do you think, despite Mao's very heavily anti-revisionist line, revisionism was still able to win after his death in China?
I think it's a combination of his, like I said, sometimes, he had his own errors and beliefs that were kind of released. Like, people like to bring up the whole thing of shaking hands with, I think, Nixon, if I'm not mistaken. So I believe a combination of his own errors, as well as, like I said, the GPCR, despite its successes, there's actually a Medium article that I can link here as well that kind of goes over the specific process of what happened in China to explain how it got to the point where it did now. But suffice it to say, I believe that revisionist errors are always going to exist, but the main thing is we have to find the correct balance between being, I guess you'd say, going after these errors without being too ultra left, you could say, because there is a fine line between, how far we should go in terms of sorting out these problems, whether it be having the masses directly interrogate, and, inquire of the various representatives of the party, like saying, hey, how do you feel about this, that, and the other thing? Or, hey, you're not doing this, so therefore we need to excuse you from the party so that we can bring this other member. So there's certain things like that. As well as, being a little bit more, I guess not harsher, but I guess you could say maybe a bit more harsh slightly on people who we let back in this party, because I believe in China, for example, I believe Mao ultimately did allow Deng Xiaoping to get back into the party despite expelling him at one point in time, which ultimately I believe was a big kind of factor in how things kind of went down. Same thing with the Soviet Union, and how individuals like Khrushchev, of course, were allowed to be in the party as well as others, which eventually led to the series of events that allowed the Soviet Union to kind of fall the way it did. But I know this is kind of like a namby-pamby answer, but literally the big thing is just keeping our eyes open, keeping our ears open to the errors that our comrades might be making. And if those errors are present, we should correct them. Obviously, we should critique them in a constructive manner. Like, we obviously should be, just flagrant with it. We should critique them in a manner that shows that, hey, if this person is willing to, accept our critique and, listen out for it, then that person should be given another chance. Whereas if someone is not willing to admit the mistake, then that person should be isolated. That actually goes to the Maoist principle of what's called the rectification campaign. If a person, like I said, is willing to admit their mistake, then yeah, give them another chance, see if they're made up, and if they are actually, who they say they are, then they more likely will correct their mistake. But if they're not who they say they are, they don't want to admit their mistake and stuff like that, then, this person, unfortunately, has to be, excluded from their party. And it doesn't always mean death. It just means, like, maybe moving them to a different position, or just having them be excluded from party activities in general. But, there are a wide variety of kind of methodologies you can take when it comes to each individual situation. But I think a harsher focus on, revisionism is essentially a core tenet of Maoism, because we believe that revisionism definitely kills. You know what I'm saying?
Okay.
Like, as you look at Russia, like, after the Soviet Union was disillusioned, like, it's truly a nightmare scenario, and that type of stuff ultimately came about because of revisionism. So that's where we kind of put a big focus on it.
Right, because Stalin ultimately made that erroneous error that class struggle ends after the revolution, and through learning from that failure, Mao actually discovered that it intensifies. You've also written an article for Maoism for the Masses for why Maoism is so important for the Black masses. Could you sort of describe your thesis in that article and why you wrote it?
Yes. So it's been really good. Taylor's just stuff to the Black struggle as it exists in America, because I believe that socialism, as a Black man, I believe that socialism is the best path towards liberating, I guess you could say, Black people from the chokehold of the U.S. Settler colonialism, which is an entirely different kind of subject. But that colonialism still definitely exists in the U.S., and we feel that the best way to go about that is obviously through socialism and communism. And I'm not the only one who feels about this. There are other, Black individuals like Black Red Guard. I believe his name. There's another individual, Dead Man Animations, when he was still around. Like, I'm not the only one who believes this, but we generally tend to believe that Maoism is the best form of socialism. Like, socialism is the way forward. And what is the best form of socialism? Maoism. So it kind of like that's kind of thought process. At least Maoism.
Okay. Full Metal Maoist, thank you so much for being on. Could you give me the URL for your website? I'll also include all the links that, if you could send me, you mentioned throughout this interview, in the description of this podcast episode. Where can they find Maoism for the Masses? And do you have any ending words?
Yeah, I definitely would always, 100% of the time, read from the horse's mouth. Everything that we say here, of course, is what we believe in, how we feel that things have happened. But the best way for you to learn Marxism, obviously, read from the horse's mouth. Read Marx, Lenin, Mao, Stalin, Fanon, whoever. If you want to know what these individuals thought and what these individuals' contributions are, just read directly from their mouth. You won't get any other better source than that. So that's what I actually made my own video a while ago. I'm talking about how people can get into Maoism, and I'll count that as well. But essentially, the number one thing is read theory. I know this is kind of like a big cliche, but it really is important. It's definitely not easy, because there's a lot of, these individuals wrote a lot, but Marxism is it's not pretty complex, but it is a bit of a complex, kind of ideology. But, like I said, it's better than the very simple lies that you'll see a lot of bourgeois, intelligence agents tell you, like, hey, well, if you want, your jobs back, well, it's the Mexicans' fault. So, like, that type of explanation is not explanation at all. It's a simple lie, but unfortunately, a lot of the masses will fall for those simple lies. And Marxism, as I said, is a complex ideology. So the best way to fully understand it, of course, is to read it. And that is, of course, where the stopgap happens with a lot of reactionaries, because you look on YouTube and you see a lot of these different YouTube videos like, LTB debunked, Marx debunked. And of course, these individuals don't actually read Marx fully, or they don't understand it. The people who But let's keep it real here. Not everybody who reads these individuals on like a serious basis fully understand everything they say. Do you think a guy who is just reading Marx solely just to debunk him is going to actually take an honest look at his work?
I mean, most of them haven't even read Marx. They've just read what other people had say Marx said.
Oh yeah, or if they do read Marx, they just read they just read the manifesto.
Yeah, that's the one that they love.
No, and not even any angles either. It's just purely just a manifesto. Even though you'll probably get a better understanding of communism broadly if you literally just read the principles of communism. There's nothing that
yeah.
there.
Yeah, the manifesto is very good for like historical materialism, but it's not the best intro to communism. I think they've made it the main like communist book on purpose, like liberal historians and bourgeois culture, just so they can like confuse beginners, in my opinion.
Yeah, they definitely have. Like I said, even the very name of it obviously is like I said, like it's a manifesto. So you think, oh, well, this is where the entire ideology is. No, that literally was just made for Marx and Engels. Literally dropped that up just as a basic synopsis for the Communist League, I believe. But in terms of the actual principles, like I said, Engels has that book down as well. And there's a lot more to the principles than even Engels had had written. Like there's a lot of information. So for those of you in the audience, of course, I always recommend reading very much first and foremost. There's plenty of places you can read, whether it be through paperback or through just reading digitally through PDFs. There's plenty of places you can find these books. I have my own different kind of reading list. I can share with you if you would like as well. I have another one as well, actually, that's actually a lot bigger than this one here. Just as well. It is a Google document, but essentially it has everything that you ever could possibly need in terms of the different parties and stuff like that. It's a full MLM reading list that I highly recommend everybody check out at least once.
Okay. Where can people find Maoism for the masses? And send me all the URLs. I'm going to include them in the description.
Alright, so here's the first set of ways. We have a core page still up. It's at Maoism-For-Masses.core.com. And of course, our WordPress, Maoism-For-The-Masses.com. Or Maoism-For-The-Masses.wordpress.com. I believe we have Medium, and I will link that as well if I can find it, but that one is kind of defunct because mostly you can read our information from our core and our WordPress.
Okay.
Outside of that, sir, do you have any other questions for me?
No, that's about it. Guys, go check out Maoism for the Masses. It's a great website for theory and history. I'm what you would describe as sort of like a traditional Marxist lens, but I absolutely love just the wealth of information on there. These guys really do great work and are really excellent comrades. And you have yourself an excellent day, Full Metal Maoist.
You too, sir. Thank you.
Yep. This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made. And a special shout out to our Marshal of the Soviet Union member, Matthias T. If you'd also like a shout out, please consider subscribing to our Patreon, where you can also get episodes up to a month early. Thank you.